There's a famous book, I believe it was written by a famous Sumerologist called Samuel Noah Kramer, and this book is called History Begins at Sumer. Now it doesn't, as we've established. It begins at, the dawn of time with the construction of the universe and the dinosaurs, and we've been over that. But certainly, when it comes to one of the oldest, sophisticated, and at least, partially understood ancient civilizations, the Sumerians in Mesopotamia, and also the neighboring peoples who would come to conquer Sumer, the Akkadians, the Assyrians, the Babylonians. This stretch of actually about 3 to 4 or so thousand years, and you can stretch those numbers out really as far as you'd like. This is the first time we have, at least some detailed evidence as to what was happening, what these people said and believed. And it's, we're not just relying on pottery and, the ruins of cities and grave sites. We know a fair bit about Sumer and Mesopotamia. We have a badly understood but still pretty substantial record of their mythology. We have a pretty decent understanding of the history of the kingdoms and the wars that constituted the history of this region from about 5 to 6,000 BCE up until basically the time of the Bible, give or take. And so there's a book here by Georges Roux called Ancient Iraq, which does a good job of, just kind of laying out the groundwork for what that history was, which kingdom ruled when. And, when you talk about ancient Sumer versus ancient Akkad and how that conflict played out. Important names like Sargon of Akkad, his daughter Enheduanna, who's the first named author. You can read English translations of her poetry, and they're pretty accessible. Sophus Helle is a scholar who's translated that. The legal codes of Hammurabi, various conquerors and kings who rose and fell as time went on. Perhaps most famously, we have what many call the world's first epic poem, the Epic of Gilgamesh. Now, in the history of Sumerian mythology, there are other, perhaps less impressive epic poems, like the story of Atrahasis, which is pretty similar to like the flood myth from the Bible. The Enuma Elish, which is a creation myth. On my YouTube channels, I've talked about the stories of Inanna, one of their most prominent goddesses. But it's true that the Epic of Gilgamesh is perhaps the most impressive and sure, one of the earliest impressive epic poems from Mesopotamia. And there are lots of cool translations of that. And as Sumer and Sumerian, and then later Akkad and Akkadian, became increasingly supplanted themselves by perhaps first the Assyrians and then most perhaps famously the Babylonians, it would be this, Babylonianized culture that would then interact with the ancient Greeks and the ancient Israelites. And so that's, you probably have heard the name Babylon a lot when it comes to the history of those peoples, right? These civilizations all knew each other. They were all neighbors.